I really tried to be. Please, please, no, please, no.
We are talking Untitled horror movie? Yes, that's actually the name of this movie. Directed by Nick Simon, who also co-wrote this with one of its stars, Luke Baines. Speaking of stars, it actually has quite a decent cast here of somewhat recognisable names. For example, we have Claire Holt, Catherine McNamara, Emmy Raver-Lampman, who you would have seen in The Umbrella Academy, Carl Penn, Aisha Tyler, both had small roles as well. And is somewhat of a meta horror comedy. Now, this is one of those movies a little bit like The Host, which is entirely filmed on Zoom, Skype type calls. Now, that may put people off. I guess you would say this is kind of a subgenre from the subgenre of found footage. And it's a kind of inside baseball kind of movie about Hollywood, but a kind of a horror film within that. So what's the story? Probably easy if I start there. So we have a cast of a fictionalized TV show. Now the cast is going to be having 6 main actors, or I think it's 5 actors and 1 writer, and they are told that their show might be cancelled. So we see them on a Skype call, kind of discussing this, and the writer, he's kind of thinking about doing his own horror film. And because these actors are will be under contract with the network for the next 12 months, and they can't then work, they agree to actually make this kind of low budget horror film that they can have more control over and things like this. So that's the idea. Now, the horror film is something like to do with ghost possessions and things like this. So just in the kind of the way of research, they end up kind of finding like a kind of a passage to read. Literally just read there. They find something to read on a website and read it. Unbeknownst to them, it actually does conjure up a type of spirit that is attacking now these 6 people. And we have these kind of like these Hollywood actors playing the role in a horror movie, all kind of over Zoom and Skype and stuff, not realising that there's actually kind of real supernatural shenanigans going on, maybe until it's too late. What'll happen? Well, you're going to have to watch the movie to find out. So as I've said, this is probably a little bit like the movie Host. Now I say probably because I haven't seen Host or The Host, but I understand it was somewhat critically lauded to a point and quite well liked among the horror community. So without kind of having seen The Host myself, I can't really give it a direct comparison, but nonetheless I would imagine it's something similar along the lines of that. This one being a horror comedy though, so a little bit kind of a light-hearted version of it at least. Now, what did I like about it? I have to say, this is probably filmed over the pandemic. It never actually mentions the pandemic, but I assume this is one of those films that were made to kind of take advantage of that kind of the social distancing that was in place, you know, in kind of most of 2020 and things like that. So that's probably why I expect films like this have kind of popped up. But it doesn't actually directly reference it, so we kind of, you know, in this particular world that this movie exists in, we don't know if that's the case or not. And it comes into one of my critiques a little bit later. But nonetheless, it's certainly a new breed of style of horror film, using the kind of technology that is, you know, is relatively recent, like the kind of like the advent of Zoom calls and things like that, which I say is somewhat of a subgenre from the found footage one, but nonetheless it's kind of like a new style of movie. So it's kind of, you feel like you'll be seeing more of these, and we've started to see a few now, and I expect probably a lot more as well. And it's probably a really cheap way to kind of make a horror film and things like that. And you'll probably at least have scenes like this in some upcoming ones. But I've got to say, despite the fact that this movie isn't a particularly interesting one, because it literally is all kind of Zoom calls, the actual story here is still somewhat intriguing. I actually was kind of like quite intrigued where this might go and how the characters were going to kind of interact with it. Now, part of the fun of this movie is seeing these kind of like diva-like Hollywood types having to deal with this kind of situation, and because they're actually making a supernatural horror film, of course the actors initially think people are trying to you know, get one over on their fellow actors by kind of incorporating real you know, effects and kind of things like this. So you have that kind of juxtaposition where there is real stuff kind of going on. Some of the characters don't quite know it yet, or not 100% sure what's going on, but they have their suspicions that people are trying just to kind of like kind of get themselves more screen time exactly by incorporating, you know, supernatural stuff into their segments and things like this. So it's kind of a quite a little fun idea, and we get lots of kind of references about horror tropes, you know, the kind of the Hollywood business as a whole, and different sort of types of people that work within that industry, and they're kind of, all our actors are somewhat kind of individual in regards to their kind of personality types. We have the kind of the diva, we've got kind of the new actor who's super enthusiastic, you know, you've got the bad boy kind of like, you know, Johnny Depp style kind of one. So we get some kind of quite fun characters as well, and because this movie is so dialogue driven and kind of so literally people looking at the camera as I am to you now, you do actually get somewhat of a good sense of who these characters are. Yes, they're somewhat kind of like cartoonish versions of you know, actors that we would see, probably, or types of actors that we would see in real life, but nonetheless I still feel we got a flavour of, you know, good enough flavour of who these characters are meant to be, even though I think some of them are you know, err on the somewhat the silly side and come somewhat over the top at times. But nonetheless, you know, there's some fun things there. There's also a couple of good jokes. I quite enjoyed some of the humour in this movie. It doesn't go overboard with kind of like slapstick stuff, but nonetheless there are some kind of amusing stuff and some quite kind of like funny sequences within the film. And I gotta say the cast do a pretty good job. I was surprised how many recognisable names I saw in this movie, or faces should I say. So, you know, it does look like you do have some decent pedigree in regards to some experience and acting here. So you'll see, you know, lots of kind of recognisable faces, mainly kind of from TV and you know, a couple from film and things like this. And despite this movie being purely on Zoom, I didn't feel it was ever slowed down too much, and it was probably an interesting film with plot development that you can have with purely a character moment where you're having people talking at screens. To a point, I will say that obviously people, they go on to maybe what didn't work, people who are wanting more of a visual representation of horror may be disappointed, because we do have attacks by these kind of this supernatural entity, and they're really kind of lo-fi. I mean, I think maybe they could have done more to add in some kind of like some effects after the fact, because when we do have these supernatural shenanigans happen on screen, it's not particularly kind of impressive. I think a little bit more could have done to make it, you know, a little bit more visually interesting. And because of that, you know, ultimately it does come a little bit samey. The plot was interesting, and I was interested to see the character's arc within it, but ultimately it is just kind of people talking on the phone. And as such, it has the drawbacks from that. So, you know, you don't get lots of kind of particularly interesting visuals, locales, special effects, things like this. I got to be honest with you, I think they should have addressed why it was all done on Skype as well. I was waiting for them to say it was actually, but you know, the pandemic was going on in this fictional universe, but they never did. But it's never actually explained why people aren't kind of rehearsing and doing these things together, and why they're kind of like filming themselves. We get a line at the beginning about how they're going to use phones to film, but you never really see why they're just filming themselves. You know what I mean? Because it's like, if you are making a film, the director, who's I suppose ultimately this writer guy at the end of the day, he would surely want to be you know, in the same room. And because we haven't mentioned the pandemic in this movie, we don't know if that actually is an issue here. So I felt more could have been done to address why this movie is filmed all over Zoom, because as it stands, it didn't really make enough sense as it is, if that kind of makes, you see where I'm going with that one. So it is kind of quite an interesting, you know, new leap into filmmaking with a new technology that, you know, I feel we'll probably see more of in the future. I don't know if there could be really too many of these films before the kind of the concept becomes a little bit of a fad and will probably burn out, you know, fairly brightly and kind of disappear, and then people have enough of these sort of films. Because that's what happened with found footage. But at least with found footage, you can kind of have different kind of locations and more kind of going on visually. This is going to get old fast, I think. But for now, I do think the concept is an interesting one, and one to obviously, you know, to use in the days of COVID, and even outside of that is an interesting concept on its own. Overall, I would say this movie is it's not a must-see. The story borrows a lot of elements from other films that you would have seen before, and ultimately, despite the meta nature of the kind of this movie, it doesn't go quite as far with those things as I maybe thought it would have done. It would have been a real kind of you know, peek behind the curtain had they gone further with it, I think. But as it stands at the moment, you just kind of get glimpses of that. So to me, it was a watchable film. It's a good one-time watch, but it's not really a classic, I don't think. So I say I can't compare it to The Host. I haven't seen that. But to me, this is kind of like a 5 out of 10. So it's a good one-time watch, I think, if you can get past the fact that it is all just filmed on kind of like camera phones and Skype and stuff. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.